All right, so today we're going to be tackling a pretty heavy topic. We're talking about the Trump administration's family separation policy at the border. Uh, it's back in the news, unfortunately.
Yeah, and understandably causing a lot of anxiety, given what we know about it now and recent developments.
Exactly. To unpack all this, we've got two really incredible sources to dive into. First, we have Jacob Soboroff's book, Separated, Inside an American Tragedy. He's an MSNBC correspondent who really got deep into how this policy came about and the consequences.
Yeah, his book is really eye-opening. He doesn't just, report the facts. He paints this really vivid picture of the human cost of this policy, the families torn apart, the trauma. It's heavy stuff.
It is. And then we have to add on another layer, the documentary Separated. It actually adapts Soboroff's book.
Wow.
But it's directed by the legendary Errol who's known for his incredible interviews, his ability to get people to open up on camera. It actually premiered at the Venice Film Festival.
Wow.
It's airing on MSNBC this Saturday night.
Yeah, that timing is so crucial. Because with Trump back in office, the possibility of this policy coming back is very real.
Yeah, it's a scary thought. So let's start with one of the most chilling parts, I think, from both the book and the film. It's about Stephen Miller, one of Trump's top advisors. So Soboroff actually heard Miller mention family separation back in 2016 during the campaign.
Yeah, what's so fascinating is that even back then it was clear this idea was meant to be a deterrent, like to discourage people from crossing the border, but no one really seemed to grasp what that would actually mean at the time.
It's just like this throwaway line that had these huge consequences, and then after the election, Soboroff starts seeing it put into practice.
He sees the impact firsthand, the chaos, the heartbreak, just utter devastation. Over 5,000 families separated. That number is just staggering.
It's hard to fathom.
And Soboroff's book really tries to grapple with this question. How could the U.S. government do this?
It's a big question. And Morris's documentary takes it even further, like digging into emails and official documents that really show how all this was planned and put into action.
It's chilling to see how casually some officials talked about separating families, about the impact on children. Really makes you question their motives.
Yeah, like they were completely detached from the human cost.
Hmm.
And that brings us to what I think is one of the most powerful aspects of both sources, the focus on the human stories.
Hmm.
And in the documentary, Morris uses this fictionalized narrative about a mother and son trying to cross the border.
It's such an effective way to show the emotional impact of the policy, because beyond the political arguments, there are real people, children, whose lives were shattered.
Absolutely. You can't help but feel their fear, their confusion, just desperation. It's heartbreaking. And this is where Morris's filmmaking really shines. Combining interviews and archival footage with these fictional scenes, it creates this really immersive experience.
And then there's that interview with Scott Lloyd, who was in charge of the Office of Refugee Resettlement at the time, the agency responsible for taking care of these kids. He comes across as shockingly indifferent to the suffering.
Yeah, I found that interview really unsettling. Here's this guy in a position of power talking about separating families like it's just another day at the office. He even admitted to being surprised that he was appointed in the first place.
It's like he's totally disconnected from the reality of what was happening. And what's even more disturbing is that both Soboroff and Morris suggest he wasn't alone. Several officials involved in the policy seemed unqualified, and yet they held the fate of all these families in their hands.
It makes you wonder how such a broken system could exist. And that sense of incompetence and indifference just runs through both the book and the film, like a bureaucratic machine just churning away, completely oblivious.
And the saddest part is that the trauma of this policy is still ongoing. The documentary points out that over 1,000 children are still separated from their families.
It's a scar that hasn't healed. And now with Trump's re-election, there's this looming question. Could this happen again?
Unfortunately, both Soboroff and Morris seem to believe it's very possible. They argue that the system itself is primed for a repeat, no matter who's in power.
That's scary. There's this sense of urgency in both the book and the film, this plea to learn from the past. And one story from the documentary really stuck with me. It's about Thomas Homan, who is the head of ICE.
Oh, yeah. He initially agreed to be interviewed for the film and then backed out last minute after traveling to the studio.
Seriously. He went all the way there and then just said no.
It speaks volumes, like a reluctance to face the hard questions, to be held accountable. Even years later, there's this defensiveness, a lack of transparency.
It's like there's still so many unanswered questions, so many stories that haven't been told. It feels like we've just scratched the surface.
That's a good point. It highlights why both Soboroff's book and Morris's film are so important. They force us to confront this dark chapter in our history, to really grapple with the moral implications.
It's not just a historical account, it's a call to action. Like, look what happened and it could happen again. What are you going to do about it?
That's the question, isn't it? We'll be back in just a moment to explore that question a little further and see what we can learn from this unsettling chapter of American history.
You know, one thing that really stuck out to me in Morris's documentary was the way he contrasts the personal stories of families affected by this policy with the cold bureaucratic language used by the officials who put it into practice.
It's such a stark contrast. Like, on one side, you have these parents desperately searching for their kids, these children terrified and alone in these detention centers. And then on the other side, you have these government officials talking about deterrence and enforcement. Like, they're just discussing spreadsheets, not human lives.
Right. It's dehumanizing. And I think Morris does a brilliant job of exposing that, like showing how the language itself was intentionally designed to strip away the individuality of these families, to make it easier to just treat them as problems to be solved, not as human beings.
Right.
Yeah, it's like they were trying to sanitize the whole thing to make it seem less cruel. But Soboroff's book doesn't let you forget about the human cost. He tells these incredible stories that really bring home the reality of what this means.
Yeah, he talks about this father who was separated from his little girl.
Yeah.
And forced to sign a document that he didn't even understand. He thought it was just routine paperwork, but it turned out to be a waiver of his parental rights.
Oh my God, that's awful.
Yeah.
I can't even imagine being in that situation, being so desperate and vulnerable, and then being tricked into signing away your rights as a parent. It's sickening.
It is, and it speaks to the power dynamics at play here. You know, these families are often fleeing violence and persecution. They're coming here seeking asylum, and they're met with this system that's designed to exploit that vulnerability.
Yeah, it's like they're being punished for seeking help. And what's even more disturbing is that there's evidence that this policy wasn't just about deterrence. It seems like there was this deliberate effort to inflict pain and suffering on these families.
Right. So Soboroff mentions how some officials referred to the separated children as tender age detainees. Such a clinical term, meant to downplay the severity of what was happening.
But these are babies and toddlers. We're talking about little kids ripped from their parents' arms and locked up in these facilities. The trauma is unimaginable.
And the long-term effects of that kind of trauma are devastating. Both Soboroff and Morris interview experts who talk about the psychological damage, the toxic stress, the difficulty forming attachments, the lifelong mental health consequences.
It's like a ticking time bomb. It's heartbreaking to think about what these kids have gone through. And the really frustrating part is that even though the policy officially ended, the damage is still being done.
Exactly. Over 1,000 children are still separated from their families, and many of them may never be reunited.
And those who are reunited often face an uphill battle, trying to rebuild their lives and heal from that trauma. It's an ongoing crisis. And now with Trump back in office, there's this fear that it could all happen again.
That fear is palpable. You can feel it in the voices of the families that Soboroff interviewed in the documentary. It's like this wound that never had a chance to heal, and now it's being ripped open again.
And it's not just the families who are affected. This policy has really damaged America's reputation. It sends a message that we're a country that doesn't care about human rights, that we're willing to punish vulnerable families for trying to find a better life.
It's a stain on our national conscience. And it raises these really important questions about who we are as a country. What does it say about us that we allowed this to happen?
That's a heavy question. But I think it's one we need to ask. And it leads to another really important question. What can we do to make sure this never happens again? I mean, it feels so overwhelming. Like, what can one person really do?
I get that it's easy to feel powerless, but I think it's important to remember that change starts with individuals. It starts with each of us taking responsibility and demanding better from our leaders.
So what does that look like in practice? What can we actually do to make a difference?
Well, we can educate ourselves. Read Soboroff's book, watch Morris's documentary, really learn about the history of immigration policy.
Right, because this isn't just a Trump-era problem. This has been going on for a long time.
Exactly. And once we understand the scope of the problem, we can start looking for solutions. We can contact our elected officials, urge them to support policies that protect immigrant families.
So use our voices to advocate for change.
Yes, and we can support organizations that are working to help families affected by this policy. Groups like the ACLU, Race is Kind, they're doing incredible work providing legal aid, family reunification services, and advocating for immigrants' rights.
So donating to those organizations is a concrete step we can take.
Absolutely. Even a small donation can make a big difference.
Yeah.
And beyond financial support, we can volunteer our time. spread awareness on social media, have conversations with our friends and family.
So it's about raising awareness and keeping the pressure on.
Right, because change doesn't happen overnight. It requires sustained effort and a collective commitment.
It can feel like an uphill battle, especially when those in power seem determined to repeat the mistakes of the past.
I know, but we can't give up hope. We have to keep fighting for what's right, for the dignity and humanity of all people, regardless of their immigration status.
Hearing you say that gives me a little bit of hope. It's easy to get caught up in the despair of it all. But it's important to remember that there are people out there fighting for change, and we can join them.
Absolutely. And the fact that we're having this conversation, that people are engaging with this issue, that's a sign of progress. It means that people care and they're willing to speak out.
That's a good point. It's easy to feel like our voices don't matter, but they do. Every voice adds to the chorus demanding change.
And the louder that chorus becomes, the harder it is to ignore.
Well, this has been an incredibly informative and, honestly, quite emotional conversation. I think we need a moment to process all of this.
I agree, it's a lot to take in.
We'll be right back to finish our deep dive into the family separation policy and explore what we can do to create a more just and humane future. All right, we're back. That was a lot. I keep thinking about how both Soboroff and Morris seem convinced that this could happen again. Like the system is just set up for it. Like family separation is just waiting to happen no matter who's in office.
It is a chilling thought. What's disturbing is that they're not just criticizing one administration or one party. They're saying there's something wrong with how we approach immigration as a country.
Yeah, what kind of safeguards would actually prevent this from happening again? Because the public outrage will fade, the news cycle moves on, but the trauma these families have endured, it doesn't just go away.
Yeah, you're right. We've already seen how quickly public attention can shift. It's so easy to get caught up in the day-to-day and forget about these long-term consequences.
So besides supporting those organizations and staying informed, what can we do? How can we actually create lasting change?
That's the question, isn't it? It gets to the heart of our role as citizens in a democracy. We can't just rely on elected officials to do the right thing. We have to hold them accountable, demand transparency, make sure our voices are heard.
It's like that saying, eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. We can't get complacent, especially with something like this.
Absolutely. And it's not just about voting every few years. It's about staying engaged in the process, participating in local government, advocating for policies that align with our values.
You know, one thing I found really helpful is learning about the history of immigration policy. It gives you a better understanding of how we got here and shows that change is possible. It's been hard fought, but it has happened before.
That's a great point. Understanding the historical context helps us see that this isn't new. People have been fighting for reform for generations. We're not alone in this.
Something else I've been thinking about is talking to people who might have different views on immigration. It can be challenging, but I think it's so important to listen to each other, to try and understand where those differences are coming from.
That ties into the bigger picture. It's about building bridges instead of walls, recognizing our shared humanity even when we disagree.
And maybe through those conversations, we can start to change the narrative, create a more compassionate and understanding approach to immigration in this country.
It's a worthy goal. It'll take time and effort, but it's essential.
This deep dive has been heavy, but so important. If you could leave our listeners with one key takeaway, what would it be?
I think it'd be this. The family separation policy, though officially ended, is still a symbol. It's a reminder that we can't be passive. We have to participate in shaping the society we want to live in, one that upholds the dignity and rights of everyone.
That's a great way to put it. And to our listeners out there wrestling with all of this, I want to add that both Soboroff and Morris offer a glimmer of hope in their work, not by sugarcoating things, but by showing that even with all this suffering, there's this incredible resilience of the human spirit, the love of families, the people fighting for justice.
Those are the stories we need to hold on to. The ones that remind us that change is possible, that hope is not lost.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. It's been a privilege exploring this with you.
The privilege was all mine. And remember, this conversation doesn't end here. Let's keep learning, keep engaging, keep advocating for a more just world.